The bells had been forged to sing victory or grief. Today they found a register between those two, each peal dragging a wake across the city, as if the sound itself were a net tossed into a sea of breath. On the dragon's back she felt the shudder of bronze ripple the air and set his scales in a fine vibration beneath her knees. The wind of his wings was a living thing, tugging at her hair, licking the ash and lime dust from her lashes. She had never heard bells like these. There was no triumph in them, nor clean sorrow, but the exhausted gasp of a place that had finally expended all its will to resist. Below lay the thorny geometry of King's Landing, the snarl of lanes and alleys, squares that were not square, courtyards like dried pools, roofs sun-bleached and pitched, heat wobbling above them as if the whole city were a kiln. And beyond everything, the bones of the red-girded fortress on the hill, its windows like eyes that had spent a night without sleep. The river light flickered where it should, but the smell was all stone, salt, old smoke, fear. Her fingers were sore on the leather of the reins, though she did not need reins with him. He turned his great head when she touched a knuckle to the side of his neck, the facet of his eye reflecting the red keep as a warped cliff, then the sky, then her face stretched into something mythic and unfamiliar. He rumbled at the bells, and the rumble's reply from deep in his chest made the city tremble on a lower note, unsuspected, as if another bell lay hidden under the ground, answering. "Not today," she said softly to the heat between his neck scales, and the word drifted away, absorbed by the roar of air. The memory of a voice, a friend's voice, swept through her like a hand smoothing a wrinkled map. Be kind, with the edge of steel beneath it. There were other memories too, jagged and bright, just below the skin. They did not disappear because she whispered. They did not consent to vanish because bells begged mercy. Grief has its own logic, but grief did not get to steer. They were over the southern wall and crossing the roofs above Fishmonger Square when she tugged him and he folded, dropping through the layers of air like a hawk made of black iron, heavy and swift but never clumsy. He landed on the ridge of a warehouse where the tiles were broken in places and patched with boards. His claws took hold, and the roof apologized with a groan but held. Around them, pigeons exploded into sky. The Unsullied were a field of blue points in the streets below, moving with machine patience, shields up, spears planted not in threat but in warning. They were sweeping the lanes and pockets, not to kill but to gather steel and keep it from hands that might forget the bells. She slipped down to the grip of the tiles and then lower to the parapet, to stand with her hands still fisted and her jaw still clenched, breathing through teeth that ached. The reins stayed looped over one of his horns. He sat like a mountain given the absurd idea of moving, and she could feel his eye on the side of her face, a weight like a warm coin. Grey Worm appeared from an alley mouth, the sun laying a pale blade on the top of his shaved head. Behind him, 3 files of Unsullied fanned and stopped on his motion. Ahead of him, 6 Lannister soldiers had their knees in the dust and their hands flat to the cobbles, fingers spread, as if there were no other way to show they were empty. Their red cloaks were turned over their heads like folded wings. The bells seemed louder here, not as a sound but as a judgment that hovered in the air like heat. She raised her hand. "Take their swords and put them in the wagons," she said to Grey Worm. "Water the men. Bind none who lay down arms. Any who raise a hand against a child or woman, cut that hand. Any who run through the streets with a torch, cut the torch and the arm that carried it." His face did not change in the slightest when he inclined his head. There was a deep tiredness underneath his discipline, a depth that had nothing to do with sleep. Her orders laid flat against that surface and were absorbed by it, not rejected, not embraced, but taken, as a man takes a weight because it must be carried. He gave them to his lieutenants like a man passing stones for a wall. This one here, this one next. The Dothraki were a different problem, and she had known it before she woke that morning. They had gathered in a restless belt along the city's southern edge, horses stamping, nostrils full of the char of broken doors and the sweet stink of fear, riders' whistle-talk tracing sharp lines between them. Victory to them was a thing you tasted, a thing that ran and was run down. Bells were the decoration at the end of a raid, not its authority. She had spoken to them before dawn when campfires were punking out and the sky was still gray as beaten tin around the edges. and the agreement they had given her was not the same manner of agreement she received from the Unsullied. Came with a stipulation, with a slant. We will hold because you ask us to, because you command and we acknowledge command, because we ride for you. But do not ask us to hold forever. The wire she walked between their desire and her own promise to herself was not thick. Now she drew her mouth into a straight line and looked south across the square. Kono glanced up at the dragon like a rider looking up at a hill that had moved closer, then back to her. His hairbell was blackened where the braid began, and his forearms were flecked with plaster dust. He had a habit of smiling when he was most frustrated. He smiled now, but his eyes were steady and resentful as bridle rings. He did not approach, for the Unsullied would have made him stop 5 paces from her whether she gestured or did not. He waited. She met his look. "Hold," she said loudly enough to carry. "Keep the horses at the square and the gate. No riding through the alleys. No taking. The city is taken. We take no thing else." She watched him consider her words as if they were a formation he had to ride around. He made a small circle with 2 fingers, a Dothraki sign like a comma. The men behind him shifted. The horses blew. A boy in the gutter, hair stuck to his skull with sweat, watched her, not the dragon, which he seemed to have categorized in his head as a piece of storm that had inexplicably landed. He held a blackened loaf of bread to his chest and a knife that had a missing tip. His knuckles were white on both. She turned her hand palm out and then down, and the knife lowered, then the loaf. She pointed toward the water wagon that rumbled and groaned into the square with its iron rims and slow oxen, the liquid inside audibly slapping wood. He darted, and an Unsullied reached to still him and then lifted him as if he were a bundle, set him down by the tap, waited while he drank, then touched the top of his head with 2 fingers. The boy's eyes did not leave the dragon the second time. Tyrion came up from the riverward end of the street walking with the kind of fatigue that made his gait a little like a ship's on a moderate swell. Sweat soaked his collar and had collected like rain at the tip of his nose. His hair and beard were stiff with dust, and flecks of lime dotted his eyelashes. His mouth was already open to say her name, but he closed it when he saw her face. The thought of the bells had been thorns to him in the days before. She knew. He had bet his soul on them, as though mercy were a method you could codify, ring by ring. His eyes found Grey Worm first, then her, then the dragon, then her again, as if he had to confirm that each still occupied the same relation to each other and to the world as before. He stopped with a courtly half-bow that was a parody of itself in his climate of sweat. "They are laying down swords," he said, not as news because she could see as well as he. "The Golden Company broke after the battering ram failed, and the gate at the fish market is ours. The Red Keep still holds. Qyburn sent a runner to ask for terms, then sent a second runner to say the first did not speak for the Queen. The bells say otherwise, but custom and obstinacy say otherwise again. The reservoirs under the hill quarter are locked and their keys have vanished, probably into some lord's pocket who fled at the first peal and did not think to leave them with his clerk. People will be thirsty by afternoon and angrier by evening. Davos believes he can pry 2, perhaps 3, of the covers without collapsing the streets on men." She nodded, the statements falling into places she had already laid out in her head. Her hand, which had settled at last at her side, wanted to close again, and she let it. "Open the reservoirs," she said. "If there are men below, get them out before the lids move. Make it a spectacle of relief, not desperation. Post soldiers, Unsullied, not Northmen, at the spouts. No one gets pushed aside. Have the old first and children. The officers of the City Watch are to surrender their rods and badges at the foot of the statue in the square. The watch who stood down when the bells rang may keep their belts and go to their homes. The ones who kept blades in their hands after the 3rd peal will be disarmed and kept in a yard without chains while we speak to their captains. If any captain is found to have ordered a post-bell attack, he will lose command. Nothing else. For now." Tyrion blinked at that last and absorbed it, massaging the bridge of his nose with dusty fingers as someone else might smooth a crease from a page. "We will need signs," he said in his practical, cautious voice. "Something the people can see and understand. It should be clear that the city has surrendered and that you have accepted the surrender, not simply deferred judgment. Mercy that looks like a pause is just fear with better posture. She was very aware of the dragon behind her, the heat of him, the low rolling of breath, a hearth before the spark. "Put a rope around the headsman's block," she said after a thought, "and hang a pitcher and a loaf from it. Leave the axe on the ground and place stones on it. Set 2 children there to sit with it, boys or girls, and give them chairs. Bring them away at dusk. Do that in every district." He stood very still. His eyes had the look of a man who had not considered that exact gesture but immediately saw its shape in the minds of others. "I will have to steal chairs," he said dryly. "Davos will be delighted to find another use for rope. Steal them and return them with thanks later," she said. "And I want parchments posted at major corners, listing what is declared this day. Bring me a scribe." She raised her voice and it went across the square as easy as an arrow. "If any of the people know how to write, bring them." An old man with a black ink stain for a thumbnail glanced up as if a hand had brushed his shoulder. He was thin as a reed, and he had been hugging the wall, invisible, as small men in great noise often learn to be. He licked his lips and began to move before anyone had time to prod him, leaving his little chalkboard where it leaned against a stoop. Another man, younger, with an apprentice's stoop and kind eyes and ink on his forearms like veins, followed him. Then a woman with the quick mouth of someone who has learned to tally fish and curses together. The bells did not stop. The city breathed under them. White cloth emerged here and there, hung from windows by hands not quite steady, flags of linen, flags of shirts. The half-scream, half-cheer that had floated up from the inner streets when the first handclap of pealing had begun thinned now to a creature that crawled out of the noise and crouched, looking around, bewildered in the daylight. John came into the square too, his hair plastered back in ropes, the hilt at his hip dark with sweat. His men were behind him, a tide with irregular currents. They were used to victory looking different. Tea than this, and some of them wore the sullen, cheated expressions of men whose anger had been borrowing against future blood and would now have to pay its debt to itself alone. He looked up at her with that same impossible honesty in his face, the only coin he spent and the only one he had to give. He took in her body, no visible wounds, only tension, and his shoulders came down half an inch. Some of the knot inside her loosened, out of proportion to the movement. "Your men," she said to him without preface. "Keep them in pairs with Unsullied. They do not move without an Unsullied between them and anyone not in armor. The Dothraki hold the gates. No pursuit, no raids." He nodded, then paused and added, with the roughness of someone pulling a word through another and not sure how it would arrive, There was something else in his eyes. She watched him decide whether to speak. He did. "I stopped one of ours in Cobbler's Lane." A woman dragged into a doorway. She screamed as if the bells meant nothing, and the man's hand meant everything. I put a blade to his throat and pulled him back into the street. He said, "They did it to ours in the north, and now we can do it to theirs." I told him to go back to the square and kneel. He went. "If I see him again, will you have him punished?" "Yes," she said, the word so easy and wholly shaped that she did not recognize her voice for a moment. She heard a note of iron in it and was glad. "Any rape is treason against my peace. Have him tied to the block. We won't use the axe today. Leave him there until dusk. Bring a cup of water each hour and set it out of reach of his hands." He looked at her as if he were seeing a kind of mercy that did not belong to any god he had prayed to, but that did not mean he despised it. He gave a short nod that was not quite a bow and went away. The scribe stood below the edge of the roof now. The old one peered up as if she were a page he had lost the place on, then clucked to himself and pointed at a stack of barrels. One of the Unsullied pulled them close so the three of them could climb and stand, faces tilted. She crouched to be closer to them, her knees barking a little against tile. The dragon's breath went through her hair like the sigh of a bellows. He was listening too. She could feel it, and that thought steadied her more than anything she had heard all day. She spoke, and the old man licked a thumb and dragged it across his chalk to clear the slate. "This is spoken to the people of the city," she said. "Write in words a fishmonger's child can read. Today, by the bells, King's Landing surrenders. I, Daenerys of House Targaryen, accept the surrender. No man is to be killed for lowering his sword after the bells. The gates are open to water and food, not to fire. From this hour until the sun is set and rises again, all houses are sanctuaries. Any soldier or rider who breaks a door shall be stripped of his weapon and bound to the block. Any man who lays a hand upon a woman or a child shall be bound to the block. The city watch will surrender its badges, which you can bring to the fishmonger's square. For each badge given, the bearer receives a token. Present it thereafter for bread at the square until the 7th day after today. Any baker who takes a token will be repaid tomorrow from the royal granaries and the captured storehouses. Write this too. The granaries will be opened. The measure of grain shall be a fair measure, not a thief's cup." The woman among the scribes smiled despite the dust on her tongue. "We call that a taxman's cup here," she said, her chalk not stopping. "Then write it thus," she returned, and the woman's grin got wider. "Write also, the queen in the Red Keep may seek terms if she wishes. Until she does, the keep is ringed and no harm will come to those inside who do no harm. Write that the people are to bring no wine to the soldiers, not to tempt them or themselves. If a child steals bread today, the mother will be asked if there is a smaller child or an old one in her house who cannot stand. If there is, the child keeps the bread and receives another loaf with it. If there is not, the child returns the bread and receives a bowl of soup and a place in the shade where others can rib him with words and not with sticks." The young scribe snorted, failed to smother it, and then looked abashed. "Shade will be charity in this heat, my lady," he said, and she found herself unexpectedly swallowing a laugh like a crumb and nearly choked on it. She coughed instead and blinked, and saw Tyrion watching her with eyes gone softer, as if he had found a corner in the world that had not burned and wanted to sit there until dusk. "Right. The bells are a law today. Anyone who defies them invites judgment. There is to be no witch hunting against those who worked for the keep. Small men must live. There will be a place for petitions in this square at sunset. If anyone knows where the keys to the reservoirs are kept, he can bring them and receive the queen's thanks. If a man who once broke the law comes with keys, the queen will forgive him the smaller of his crimes." She paused. "We will talk of greater crimes another day. Do you want your full titles?" the old man asked dryly, chalk poised. "No," she said. Surprise lit his eyebrows. "Write only what they need to know, and write this last. The bells mean life today. Tomorrow we will ask what sort of life." The bells rolled on and changed nothing and changed everything. Grey Worm had set the wagons already in the square and had the water taps manned. He watched a woman spill her tin cup, the water hitting flagstone and spreading in a sudden darkness that was more beautiful than anything she had seen in a month. She laughed, then clapped a hand over her mouth as if laughter were tasteless. He gestured to the soldier at the tap. Another cup was given. The woman drank without guilt that time. She looked at the dragon as a girl looks at a SWO. RD fear and hunger in the same cut of eye. News in a city is a series of hands passing a hot coal. Whispers that leave blisters. Before the parchments were nailed to doorposts and tavern lintels, before Davos had pried the first iron lids from the underground cisterns and got amphory lowered to the men gasping in the stale air underneath, the fact of her not burning the city had gone out with legs and unsteady breath. It had an argument attached to it, for or against. They say she didn't burn us, though she could have. They say she will anyway at dusk. They say she's different. They say difference is only waiting with another name. They say the dragon is the same as a torch or a star. They say there was a girl once who opened the slave pens and then burned the master's ships. They say, when she descended to the square and let her boots take the cobble's heat through their soles, the murmurs congealed. A man pressing stones on the headsman's axe drew back as if it might hop and bite him. 2 children sat on the chairs that had been stolen from a fishmonger's stall, legs too short to reach the ground, heels knocking against the chair rungs. One of them had a smear of something like tar on her cheek, and a boy standing beside her tried to wipe it away with a fish-scented rag. The girl made the kind of face that is made in every city and every desert and would be made in any instead. She moved through the throng, and the throng parted without a sound. The dragon above them put his head over the edge of the roof and made a soft noise she had learned when he was a hatchling. A question. She looked up, and he looked down, and something passed back and forth that was no one's business but theirs. An old woman with a scarf of faded yellow pushed forward through the press, elbows out, the way that grandmothers move in harvest markets when the grain is low. She stopped because unsullied spears crossed in front of her, and also because she had reached the place where the air changed around the person it circled around. "Are you the one they call mother in other places?" she asked, eyes narrowed against the light. Her voice was like a bare branch tapping a window. "I am a queen," she said mildly. "I am the one who chose to accept the bells. Queens have ripped us up like weeds since before we learned how to salt fish," the old woman said. The lines around her mouth were not the lines of laughter. Not only. She shook her head like someone trying to dislodge water from an ear. "But you've put bread and a pitcher where the axe is. My niece's boy is bound at the wrists for stealing a sack of barley from a lord's yard in Sparrow Lane. He's a fool, but fools shouldn't be eaten by the law while clever men go fat. Will he be cut? Or will a man talk to him who isn't angry?" "He will be spoken to by a man who isn't angry," she said. "Send for him. He can return the barley if it can be returned. If not, he can dig a trench for a day and then go home with his hands and the same number of fingers he had this morning." The old woman did not smile. She may have forgotten how without effort, but she bowed, which was stranger. "Then feed this city," she said, as if this were a prescription for an illness and not a request. "That is the plan," she replied, and the woman nodded and was gone into the crowd as if she had never existed. She did not try to mount any steps or find any balcony. She did not speak from above to the square. She lifted up the parchment instead and gave it to the old ink-stained man, who nailed it to the lintel where a butcher's sign had hung, and the crowd pressed forward like a tide, reading, misunderstanding, correcting their misunderstandings, arguing, pointing at the axe and then at the children who kicked their heels. A man turned to her with his jaw trembling and then stopped it with his hand. A girl with black eyes hugged herself and looked at her feet. A Northman behind John laughed once, loudly, then shut his mouth when an Unsullied turned his head an inch. John spoke to his sergeants with hands and chin and then went to the fountain where Davos had gotten water to rise, a peal of cool silver over stone, and began to haul mugs with the possessed, practical rhythm of a man who would rather do than speak. When she looked to the north, toward the Red Keep, the heat shimmered above it. The air above those stones seemed textual, as if written with invisible letters that could never be erased. Above that, the sky was clear as a shield's burnished face. She did not need to see the tower rooms to know who stood at those windows because she could feel it. There are hatreds that are architects. They build rooms inside you and locate other people there, not to house them but to address them. She had a room for the queen inside, and the queen had one for her, and the rooms had windows that looked at each other across a city. "Qyburn wants a parley," Tyrion said, apropos of nothing, because the thought had returned to him and would not leave. "If you agree, he will come under a white flag halfway between the Fishmonger's Gate and the first incline up to the keep. He will say that the bells were rung by men who are dead or will be soon, and that the queen does not acknowledge the city's surrender, only the city's fear. If you agree, he will ask for time, and that time will be for desperation. It is possible she will try something. Wildfire, or a bolt at your dragon from a window, or a knife from a boy you would never suspect. If I disagree," she asked, "then he will whine that you are no true queen and ask where in the law you found your bells. I will explain that your law is a dragon sitting on a roof who is not burning us," he said. "Then I will tell him to go back to his mistress and lead her back down. And he will go because he is a man who loves his own mind, and that mind does not function well when he is too near danger." He glanced up at the dragon and then away, with a face that said, "I have had enough of too near danger to last several lives." She minded none of it because she had already made the decision. "I will meet him. I will not go halfway. Let him come to the square. Let him come to where the axe has a rope around it." "Symbolically difficult for him," Tyrion murmured, almost happily. and discovered that his mouth knew how to smile in the heat after all. They did not have long to wait. The crowd thickened not because people rushed to see the parley, but because the parley would intersect with bread. Word had gone out that a white flag would cross the square, and the city's rumor had spun threads from it and strung beads. By the time Qyburn stepped into view with his neat robe dusted to a pale gray and his white token held so delicately it might have been a medical instrument, the street was a pulsing artery and the square a heart. The Unsullied had made a path where there could be none, which was itself a magic trick. They held it with their bodies, smooth and unhurried. Qyburn was the sort of man who looked at the presence of a dragon as if it were a curiosity and a hazard, but mostly a question. A riddle he had most of the words to answer and only lacked a conjunction. His eyes landed on her, and he manufactured an expression suitable to someone who sees another person in a doorway at a sickroom where a loved one lies. Sorrowful, formal, interested in two things at once. "Your Grace," he said, "the bells have, spoken, but my queen has not. She asks for terms for the castle and those within it." His eyes flickered, not entirely in his control, to the perch above them and the curve of a black claw that could have been a scythe. "Your queen asks from behind stones she would not leave," she said, her voice flat in the heat. "She may ask. These are the terms. She will come down unarmed with her guards unarmed and stand upon the flagstones there, in the open. I will approach with my men. There will be witnesses from the people. Not lords, not soldiers, but tradesmen and mothers and those who pushed their carts through this city when neither she nor I had any claim to it. In their sight, she will give over her crown and say that she will be tried for her crimes in this city by a panel of men and women who live here and have not held office. Her child will not be used as a shield for her. I will protect anyone who lays down arms, and I will feed anyone who stands in line. Those are the terms. They are open as a window in summer and not complicated. If she refuses, the keep is ringed. No one will go in, no one will go out. We will wait. There is bread and water enough outside the keep to wait as long as it takes. You propose then," he said gently, "to starve the castle into reason. I propose to insist upon it," she said. "There is no wildfire that can burn a city that refuses to burn with it. She knows that. Tell her I said so. Tell her the bells were not rung to beg me. They were rung to save her people from her. If she will not be saved by them, then she is alone." "She is the queen," he said, the whisper of habit thick on the word. "She is a woman in a tower," she said back. "Both things can be true until sundown." He gazed at her a moment longer, then made a bow that was a physician's concession, not a counselor's. On his way out of the square he looked, as he could not help it, at the axe which lay under stones with a rope around it, at the chairs and the soot-smudged girl and the boy who had stopped daubing her cheek and was now counting stones in the rope's coils as if any number might alter an outcome. He did not smile, but his mouth that had been pinched into the temporary grief of a professional warmed perhaps a degree, as if he had seen an interesting tincture in a neutral bottle and wished to open it later. They watched him go as one watches a swallow leave a stable. He was not a bird to inspire much feeling, but he moved, and movement makes men look. The bells in some higher quarter stopped and started, a road of sound opening and closing. She felt the first drag of ache at the base of her skull and ignored it. The truer hurt was elsewhere and had no bones. It reached for her now as it did at inconvenient hours, and as it would for a long time to come, she knew. She almost welcomed it because it was a reminder that her compass had not turned in her hand without her leave. Grief points, too, but she did not take it up, not here and now, not in this heat with a parley in the balance and a city still learning how not to flinch. "Jaime Lannister is alive," Tyrion said, as if he had tasted iron and had to declare what he tasted or else swallow and suffocate. He was found trying to reach the red keep through a postern that had been walled in years ago. He may have been hoping to climb along the river culverts, a foolish hope. He is in a cart shed now with 4 of the Unsullied outside and a barrel for convenience. He is not, as ever, small. She did not turn her head as sharply as she felt the desire to. The band at the base of her skull tightened. "You freed him," she said. "It was not a question." "I did," he said, and his mouth moved to make more words. then decided perhaps that there were none. I meant to save many, not just two. It has been my practice, he added with a dry self-scourge, to intend much and achieve something else. She thought of the woman in yellow, of the boy with the blackened loaf, of the child sitting with the axe. She thought also of the heads in the bay where once ships had kissed water, and of a wall of men with spears who made choices in words like orders and felt nothing and everything afterwards. "Take me to him," she said. "Bring John and Grey Worm. Leave the Dothraki where they are." They crossed streets whose names she did not know yet and would have to learn. The city was solid around them with an almost audible density. She could see how it made rulers into different creatures. T.'s crush of walls and lives, the way it required them to look down from windows into boxes full of people whose faces blurred into patterns the longer you watched. She walked at street level and the pattern did not blur, which was both a comfort and a series of wounds. A woman sat on a stoop with her mouth open and her hands moving unconsciously, as if she were kneading a dough that would not come together. A man with a broken collarbone bowed and the injury widened and pinched in the skin like a pursed mouth. A child had a slice of watermelon and no one tried to snatch it because an unsullied watched him with a placid, fish-eyed calm that dared anyone to try. The cart shed was of the low, heavy sort, no room to stand upright for a tall man, its roof made of beams and a thatch that was sliding. The black horse that would have stood there had been turned out, and now the stall was occupied by a man who had once been the only person in a room who could make a jest and mean it and not mean it in the same breath. His hair had gone gray like a brush set down and forgotten. His beard had made that part of his face into a memory of a face. He looked up without surprise because there was none left in him. He had spent his store already for worse days, and this one had only the dignity of heat. He stood slowly, his hands bound but not harshly. One of the Unsullied had set the binds in a way that did not cut and also did not promise comfort. Jaime looked at Tyrion first, and the look that passed over his face was a weather, moving, unhurried, without malice. Then he looked at Jon, and something like respect and apology and blankness took their turns. When he looked at her finally, he gave something that was not a bow and not a shrug consideration, perhaps. "If you have come to hear me say that I regret things," he said, voice like a dry board sliding, "I do, though the measure of the regret may not be the one you want. If you have come to kill me, do it outside and send a boy to tell my sister that a Lannister died in a cart shed like a mule." She looked at him for a time longer than politeness allows because the chewed ends of courtesy did not interest her, and because she wanted to understand the things that had built and unbuilt this man until he was a ruin you could walk in and see the sky through. She saw the empty place on his right wrist where a hand had been, and the flesh smiled there with shiny lips. She saw how he stood with his weight on a foot that did not want to bear him. "I came to ask where the city's keys are," she said lightly, and his eyebrows lifted for the first time that day. "You may be of no use in finding them, but you can answer another question. Will your sister come down? Or will she wait until hunger comes up to her?" He considered. It was an act he respected. He did it like a man who tries on a glove he had not worn in some time. "She believes in stone," he said finally. "She believes walls are a kind of love, and that if you build them high enough the things on the other side cannot be as real as the things within. She believes hunger is a rumor told to women to make them cook. And she believes that if she is to die, she should die on a high place in view of those who hate her. She might come down if she thought it would make you weak to see her yield. You would have to make yielding a kind of victory. You have started, I see." He tipped his head toward the door, taking in the noise of bread and water and bells and argument. "Your child," she said. "Is there one?" The exact shape of the lie or truth that moved through his face was too complicated to name. "She believes there is." "I wanted to believe there was," he said, and that was answer enough for now. "If there is, would you tell me that your mercy extends to it?" She did not blink. "Yes." "Then there is still a city beyond the Red Keep," he said, as if answering himself. He lifted his bound hands a fraction. "I will tell you where men keep spare keys like they keep spare thoughts. In the drawer no one opens because it sticks. The drawer is in the house of a clerk who eats each day because he knows how to lose papers. I can take you there, or tell you where it is, and you can send one of your quiet ones. "We have quiet ones," John said without interest. He did not look at Jamie as he spoke. His eyes were on her face. She could feel the look like firmness underfoot. She chose. "Tell Grey Worm, if the clerk has a family, do not frighten them. If he has secrets that are not useful today, leave them in their drawers." She turned as if to go and then turned back. "Do you regret pushing a boy from a tower?" she asked abruptly. The question had been in her mouth for hours, for years. She was not sure. He shut his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was sand in them. "Every day," he said, "and not in the way that impresses men. No fine burden carried with the set of the jaw. It is ugly, ordinary regret, the sort that sneaks up in a tavern when you drink, the sort that keeps your mouth from tasting anything when the food is good, the sort that haunts your sleep with small feet." He lifted his bound hands another inch, then let them fall. "If you must cut my head, do it knowing that. If you do not, do something with the boy I tried to kill and the city he saved from my hand. Do something that makes my regret look smaller than your plan." She left him then because she had no interest in spending the day inside a shed. The sun tilted toward afternoon and the city found out how thirsty it could be. In the hill quarter, Davos swore with mathematics, dividing the force he had and the number of bars and the leverage required to be safe. Twice a man's weight on the end of this timber, a chain wound here, the iron squealing and then popping, a puff of ancient air coming up smelling of wet coins. Unsullied pulled men up through the circles of stone like fishermen hauling nets with unexpected catch. Women stood with tea. Air hands held out and their palms cupped in habit, though the thing they were begging for today was not alms but a turn, and a turn is both easier and harder to give than a coin. The first parchments had been read and reread and had little circles of discussion around them as men and women argued over whether the queen had meant what she wrote or whether she had been caught in the act of meaning by the city's heat and would be different when the air cooled. Children took the tokens for bread from the watch and ran home with them the way they had once run with frog's pawn or found feathers. A man took off his tattered red cloak and made a pillow of it for his baby asleep on a doorstep, which was as new a thing for that cloak as could be imagined. She saw the first attempt at breaking and stopped it with a word. A Dothraki had gone to the door of a spice merchant who had left his shutters open and his jars covered with cloth and simply stood looking. Nothing in that look was a threat and everything in it was. The man of the house came to the door and put his hand out and said something in a language of counting. Kono was there before anyone else could step, his voice a rope thrown ahead, his horse moving like a taste. He put his hand on the other Dothraki's shoulder and said a low string of words that translated themselves in her ear to, "Not now, not here, or she will make a new kind of law with you." The rider looked at her, then at the dragon, then at the law. He wheeled his horse as if turning away were a trick and not a retreat. Kono met her eyes later and she gave him a nod. He rejected it with a jerk of his chin and rode back to the gate, which was also obedience. At sunset, when the heat rolled off roofs like animals dragging themselves backwards into their caves, when the light slanted through dust in the lanes and made everything holy for the span of a breath, when the bells had rung so long that the city had begun to hear silence underneath them and call it a mercy, men and women brought their petitions to Fishmonger Square. She had asked for them and they came because you cannot ask a city to speak and be surprised when it has much to say. She did not sit on a chair. A chair would have offended her feet. She stood on the cobbles that had been warmed all day and now were giving back their heat like beds that had been slept in by many bodies. Tyrion stood near her because he knew how to sort a stream into tributaries, and Davos because he had learned to read men's mouths when their words could not be trusted and she trusted that skill, and Jon because his presence had the power to make a riot into a crowd. Grey Worm was a wall 3 paces to her left. The dragon had moved to a higher roof and lay with his head on his forearms, like a cat stretched to one side of a sunlit window. The first petition was from a woman who wanted to know if her husband, a city watchman who had thrown his badge into a latrine when the bells sounded because he was ashamed of what men like him had done last year when the grain had been tight, could have a token anyway. "He is a fool," she said with affection and contempt braided together. "But I should not like our children to have smaller bellies for his honor. Give her 2, she said, and a murmur went through the square and then died. The second was from a baker who wanted to say he could give bread without tokens if the flour came, if the price of flour did not double before noon merely because the sun had come up. "I cannot command flour," she said, "but I can open storehouses and set a fair price. Anyone who sells a sack for more than that price will be without a shop tomorrow. Any man who wants to keep flour and sell it later will watch his flour go to soup today." The third was from a boy who stepped forward shaking and said that his father had locked the smallest reservoir under their house, because their house was old and pious and had collected water under its floors for 100 years, and his father had kept the key and said he would not give it because it was their family's right, all the men saying it in their kitchen like a prayer, and the boy had taken it while his father snored, and he held it now, and would she be angry? And if so, would she be angry at him and not his mother? She held out her hand, and he put the key in it as if it might bite her and she would deserve it. She closed her fingers over the cold metal and nodded to Davos, who took it in his blunt, careful fingers and nodded again. "What is your name?" she asked the boy. "Rafe," he said, and added in a rush, "Rafe Alder's son." "Rafe," she said, "you did a brave thing. Your father can be angry and wrong at the same moment. If he is only angry, take him to the water once it flows and then ask him to be wrong later, but not tonight. There is a difference between being a man and being stubborn. You have chosen the first. Take a token for your family for a week. Then go home before your father wakes." He moved back into the crowd with the slow gait of someone who thinks if he moves too quickly the present will catch up and change its mind. There were many more. A woman who had lost a sister and wanted to hate the wrong soldiers with all her teeth. A man who had hated too well and too long and asked if he might continue. A smith who offered to send his boys to mend pots at the square for old women, because he had always liked old women and their gossip. A man missing 3 fingers who asked if there would be a tax tomorrow, and if the tax would be called by a name and given a different face. A wharf girl who wanted to know if there would be songs about this day and whether they should be bawdy or solemn. A priest with a soot mark on his brow who wished to know if calling her merciful would make the gods laugh. She answered what she could, and what she could not, she listened to and did not pretend to understand. There is a mercy in admitting ignorance. As not a mercy she had learned early. It was fully dark when Qyburn returned again. He did not bring the queen. No one expected him to. He had a small parchment in his hand, and his face wore the expression of a man who has tried to make a small thing carry a large meaning and failed. "She will not come down," he said in the careful rhythm of a messenger who has polished his words on the way so that he cannot be misunderstood, and therefore cannot be blamed. "She says the bells were rung for her, to celebrate her survival and the city's, not for you. She says she will speak to you at her window when you come to speak with her under it. She says that if you cannot do that, you were not meant to be queen here anyway. She says many things," Tyrion murmured. "She says she will eat what she has and drink what she has and listen to the bells as long as they sound, and when they stop, she will make her own," Qyburn continued. He finally let his eyes rest on her. He was a man who had killed any fondness for metaphors in himself years ago, and now had to live in a day that was all of them. "Then we will wait," she said. She did not look at the red keep. "And in the morning, if she has not come down, we will raise the white flags on the hill, not on her walls but on the slopes, so she can see them when she looks out and know that her city has made a different choice than she has." She felt the words settle around them like a second dusk. "There will be no attack tonight. There will be no torches thrown. If there is any, there will be no forgiveness." She looked down into the crowd, not up to the keep, and found faces she did not know and would not remember and did not need to remember for this moment to matter. The dragon lifted his head and tasted the air. The wind had turned slight and brought the smell of the sea into the square. A thin salt thread that wound its way through the onion and the urine and the tile dust and the fear. He made a small, contented sound. She looked up at him and felt the complicated map of her heart shift a fraction. A correction, of course. When at last she allowed herself to sit, it was on a low step at the edge of the square. No one approached her then. There is a reverence that is not about worship but about letting a person be with their fatigue. Jon stood 2 strides off and leaned his shoulder against a post and watched the square as if it were a field he had plowed and now needed only rain. Grey Worm was not there. He had slid away to inspect the lines at the cisterns and the men on guard, and to stand a while somewhere. He could bleed a little invisible blood for a woman who had died with her hands bound and her teeth tight and who would never drink another cup of water. Tyrion had sat on the ground with a sigh and then fallen asleep sitting up. His head dropped back against a barrel, his mouth slightly open in the posture of an exhausted child. Davos had gone to find rope for something else and had not returned, perhaps because the rope had turned into something else entirely. The stars above were burnt pinholes in the velvet of old smoke. "Did you think you would choose this?" Jon said into the side of the night, not as a challenge but as a genuine question. "No," she said. "I thought I would choose once loudly, and the choice would echo in every chamber and the world would change to match it. I thought my will would be a kind of fire. I was wrong. The world is stubborn. It needs to be fed, not burned." She glanced at him. He had gone thinner. He had always looked more like a man who should be scything a hayfield than riding to war, and now he looked like a man who would need 2 bowls of soup to steady his hands, then asleep without dreams. "And you? Did you think mercy would look like this?" "I thought mercy would look like not killing," he said. "I did not think that mercy would be so much lifting and hauling and finding keys. I did not think mercy would be this heavy." He rubbed his thigh as if the weight of the day had settled there and had to be kneaded out. "Wearing a crown is mostly lifting," she said, and then heard the absurdity of the words and nearly laughed again. "The crown is for other people to see. The weight is in finding chairs for 2 children to sit by an axe." A dog went by, trotting, with a loaf in its mouth, and no one stopped it. It found a place under a cart and began to chew with sublime contentment. A cat watched from a wall with an expression of detached scorn that was the natural right of cats everywhere. Somewhere a woman began to sing under her breath, not a song anyone knew, but a melody that had been invented to wrap around the notes of that day and keep them from clattering in a bucket. When sleep came for her, it came because her body had decided it had had enough of her mind. She slept not in a bed in some commandeered room but leaning against the dragon's foreleg, his breath a tide on her hair. She did not dream of fire. She did not dream of bells either. She dreamed of rope around an axe handle and children sitting above the weapon their city had used, of water slapping wood, of the cool shock of a pitcher against a thirsty mouth. At dawn, the city smelled clean for the first hour. It is always thus in summer before commerce and anger heat the air. Men with long poles pierced skins of brine and let them gush out into gutters, a perfuming trick old as the quarter. The first babies cried, the first curses turned the air blue, then the jokes, then the arguments about prices, then the quick, furtive roosters of the last remaining carts. Above it all, new sound, white flags moving on the slopes below the Red Keep, catching morning wind, making a visible sound if not an audible one. Cersei did not come down. The first answer she gave to the flags was the silence of pages at windows moving aside. The second answer was a band of archers walking the outer wall with their bows not strung and their faces not turned upward. The third answer was Qyburn again, who had slept less than anyone and still had somehow found the time to comb his hair. "She will not yield," he said, and because he was more honest in the morning than at dusk, he did not add courtly preambles. "She believes that if she endures, you will break yourself against what she did not do last night. She also believes, forgive me, that you are a creature of the first day of your choices. She believes you have given mercy once, and now you will want to take it back with interest to prove that you are not weak." "Then she does not know me," Daenerys said, and the calm in her voice surprised even her. "We will continue as we have begun. Any Golden Company men who surrender will be stripped and fed. Any Lannister officers who surrender will be allowed to write letters to their households. Any who burn a lantern near a stock of oil will find themselves outside the city. Send word to the Iron Bank clerk we turned up last night that his offices are seized for audit. I will have his books on the table by noon. Tyrion, you will sit with me. Davos, find a man to mend the fountain in the Inkseller's quarter. It turns to a dribble after an hour. We will need it all day. You will sit in the square and read ledgers?" Qyburn asked, appalled into candor. "I will sit where the people can see me," she said. "It is a habit rulers forget to practice until they require it and find they have forgotten how." He pressed his lips together and bowed and made his way back toward the slope with the stiff caution of a man who walks among cats carrying fish. They brought the ledgers. They brought hunks of bread like stones and wheels of cheese the color of the sun, split with knives meant for rope and meat. They brought bolts of cloth that were to be payment to men who had risked life with their shoulders prying the iron lids. They brought a clerk who wiped his scalp with a handkerchief until it went transparent, and a woman who had kept books for a tavern and astonished every man she met by knowing sums they had forgotten. They brought Jamie again when she asked he be brought, and he sat with his back against a post and listened without comment as men haggled about the future of coin. He did not offer counsel, and she did not ask it. They brought Arya without knowing they had brought her. She came more quietly than any of them, a shadow that made water its ally and then became the sort of thing that stands by water and watches, possessing nothing, wanting nothing, holding still under a heat she seemed to find interesting. When Daenerys saw her, it was from the corner of an eye and was as swift as the memory of a knife. Arya's face held nothing for her. It was a face that had walked a long way and learned all the faces it needed, then put them down. If there was any feeling there, it was the faintest curl of the lip at watching men who had never hauled a net discuss how many fish could be carried before the rope cut hands. At some point, she came forward and took a seat beside the children on the chairs near the axe, and no one told her to move because there was no one foolish enough. "Are you here to kill me?" Daenerys asked when Arya's eyes found hers and acknowledged the fact of intersection. The words were not dramatic. She was proofreading a ledger line with one finger as she spoke. "No," Arya said after a beat in which she considered the question as if it were a sort of bread and might be stale. "Not today." Her eyes moved to the dragon's shadow, making a tract of coolness on the square, and then up to the dragon himself, counting the scales in the shadow as if she could use the number for something later. "Then do you wish to help?" Daenerys asked, and only Tyrion among them showed surprise. "There is a work that requires people who can move through rooms without staining them with their presence. There are keys still in drawers, and men who believe they are still lords. And there are children who have not been found by their mothers because the city is a maze that behaves like a sea when you are small. Find the children. Bring them to the square. Put chalk marks on doors for others to know they have been searched. Take a kettle and a rope as your authority. No one resists a woman with a kettle and a rope. They only ask covetous questions." Arya's mouth did a thing like the thought of a smile. "I can do that," she said. She stood, light-footed and without ceremony, as a woman who had been a fishwife's apprentice. A made-up thing she put on like a dress to cover the truth, and went away with a coil of rope and a kettle that had dents with histories. The noon heat came like a hand pressing down. Men who had not cared a fig for shadows suddenly remembered the love of their mothers. They tied cloths around their heads and got scolded by old women for doing it wrong. The march of the day had that solid inevitability which belongs to work that does not feel like heroism but will keep people alive. Tyrion's voice went hoarse and he began to communicate with finger taps on the table. 2-4, give the baker 2 sacks. 3-4, tell the clerk we'll look at that page later. For 4, I need water or I will perish and then be of no use to anyone. And she laughed at him when he did it because he had invented a new language born purely of need. In the second hour past noon, a watch officer, his badges surrendered but his spine still straight from years of training in how to look like a wall, came forward with news that a group of his men had found a green clay jar in a cellar that made their tongues tingle and their eyes sting. Tyrion's head snapped up so fast he groaned and rubbed his neck. Davos swore softly without heat. "Set it in the river," Daenerys said immediately. "Half a mile down, beyond the boats. Break it open underwater and let it be the river's problem." "How many such jars do you think there are?" she asked Tyrion without moving her eyes from the officer because she did not want him to think they were discussing anything but obedience. "More than enough," he said. "Less than we can guess. She will have left some where no one will find them for a month, hoping to make a month of fear do what a day of fire could not. We will find some and we will step on them gently and we will not speak of it. We will speak of it enough," she said very quietly. "Not to panic them but to educate them. Fear grows best in barrels." She turned to the officer. "Take your best swimmers. Do it as if you are cutting an onion, gently and with your face turned a little away. If you die, I will be very angry, and I prefer not to begin my anger with apologies." He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded as if he had made up his mind about her for the day and perhaps for the week. He went away with two men who were all bone and sinew and white eyebrows. They carried the jar as if it contained not an explosive but their grandmother's ashes. She felt the fatigue creep back into the base of her head. Her voice remained steady, and her hand did not shake when she signed the small writs that would go to bakers and to tanners and to men with boats. It seemed absurd that a dragon kept the sun off a portion of the square, and that beneath that window she wrote promissory notes as if she were a clerk at a desk by a window in a merchant's office. It seemed more absurd that the city flourished in that shadow. In the third hour, Kono rode into the square with his horse's nostrils flared and his eyes bright and his mouth set in a line that would have put fear into a lesser woman but only made her look to his hands. He had them open, which was good. He had a boy in front of him on the saddle, which was almost as good. His hand held the boy firmly but gently. The boy clutched something wrapped in cloth to his chest as precious as a crown. "Queen," Kono said. He liked that word as a flavor on his tongue. "This boy says his father keeps jars in a hole under their floor. This boy says his father told him that if fire ever came he should throw one at the fire to make it go away." He looked at her with the kind of mockery that belongs to a friend who has watched men behave like simple tools. "Shall I give you the boy and cut off the father's hands? Give me the boy and leave the father's hands on his arms until we use them to dig the jars out," she said. "Then we will talk to him about the difference between throwing water on oil and throwing oil on water." She lifted the wrapped thing from the boy and held it like an infant, and felt the faint prickle in her sinuses and the delicate burn on the back of her throat. "Take this to the river men," she said, and Kono wrinkled his nose and then smiled because courage that smells is more interesting than the other sort. The boy had a shaved place on the side of his head where a louse problem had been solved decisively. He looked at her as if he should know her but had no reason to. She squatted so they were eye to eye and the bracelets at her wrist clicked softly. "You did well," she said. "My father is not bad," he blurted. "He just believes what he is told too hard. We will give him other things to believe," she said, and stood and nodded to Kono in dismissal and thanks. He wheeled the horse neatly, took the boy off with a single-handed lift, set him on the ground almost tenderly, then rode like he was glad to have an excuse to move. It is a strange thing, how quickly a city will begin to look like it has always been in its new shape. By late afternoon, the sight of Unsullied posted beside Dothraki at corners was no longer novel. The part of the crowd's attention that had been consumed by fear had freed itself to focus on the more comfortable occupation of complaint. A woman told Tyrion that her husband snored and could she have a writ to make him stop, because surely if the queen could open reservoirs she could close a mouth. A man asked if the queen would consent to marry his sister because she had refused 3 good offers for bad reasons and now he was tired of supporting her insistent freedom. Tyrion laughed so hard he had to sit down. Davos blushed, Jon blinked, and the rest of the square experienced that bright relief that comes when a joke is very silly and all the better for it. She did not dismiss such nonsense as a waste of time. A city was a creature that needed to flex its jest muscles as much as its shoulders. As the second day sagged toward evening, a ribbon of movement appeared at the foot of the Red Keep. It did not look like much at first because it was not much. A single figure in white flanked by 2 in steel, coming down with the kind of stubborn step that belongs to someone who has never had to learn to put one foot in front of the other without anyone watching. She did not move. She did not call for honors. She simply waited and the square breathed in, and then let the breath out again slowly as if it would explode if the air left too quickly. The woman in white did not reach the square. She stopped at the edge where the slope flattened and looked at the flags and at the dragon and at the rope around the axe. She lifted her chin with a motion that in another life and another room would have made men applaud. The bells had not rung for an hour. Silence described the distance between them. After a time, she turned and went back up the hill. "Tomorrow," Tyrion said, and his voice was like a stone being put gently on the ground after a long carry. He was not smiling anymore. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The word did not feel like a promise or a threat. It felt like both and neither. It felt like a rope you throw from a ship to a dock that might yet not catch. But you throw again because that is what you do. That evening, she walked the alleys with Grey Worm, and with Jon at her left, and with 2 lamplighters leading them, lifting their poles to light lamps that had not been lit for a month, turning the city slowly from black to a soft yellow that made even the broken things look as if they were waiting for repair rather than being abandoned to it. People watched her go by and said nothing and said everything with their eyes. A girl in a doorway lifted her chin in fierce silence. An old man nodded as if he had asked something of the day and it had surprised him by answering. A drunk wove in and out of their path and was gently turned by an unsullied shield like a sheep by a dog, and did not notice he had been kept from bruised ribs. At the final lamp, the lamplighter lowered his pole and his arm trembled with effort. She put her hand to the pole and helped lift it. It was so small a thing that it would not be remembered by anyone but the 4 who were there, and perhaps not even by them. But she felt the weight in her muscles and was glad that it was ordinary. Under the final light, the dragon settled, making half the street a drum. He did not like lamplight. He liked the moon best. He tolerated lamps because she did. When at last she lay down near his foreclaw, the cobbles were warm through her cloak and the air had a sea skin, damp and easy on the lungs. She closed her eyes and did not dream. On the 3rd morning, the bells did not ring at all. At first, the absence felt like a lost step on a stair. The city held its breath and waited for the sound that had stitched its yesterday together. When it did not come, complaint rose like steam. The bells should announce that the day knew its own name. She looked up at the red keep and caught sight, only just, of a figure at a window in the eastern tower. She did not try to imagine the thoughts behind that face. She did not want to spend today living in someone else's house. She climbed the slope this time. She did not go to the wall. She stopped halfway, where the wind came off the sea without obstruction and the smell of the city fell away into a brighter salt. She stood there, Grey Worm at her right and Jon at her left and Tyrion a step behind and Davos counting. It seemed the stones under his foot. She held up a hand and Davos stopped counting, and the dragon above tilted his head, and the slope waited. "Cersei of House Lannister," she called, and the wind took her voice and returned it in a gentler form. "Come down. If you come now, the city will say it was because you loved it enough to spare it hunger. The city will not be wrong. There are many words a place can choose to describe a day. Let it choose this one. Do not make it choose a worse." There was a long interval then in which the world made noises of itself. Waves, gulls, a cartwheel complaining, a child laughing, a door slammed, a mother hushing. When the answer came, it was not in a human voice. It was in light. At every corner along the slope, the white flags lifted their soft squares and told the story of a wind that ran up the hill like a child. The red keep did not change its face. The city watched the flags billow and the dragon watched them and the queen watched everything and felt, for the first time in many years, that the word waiting might be an action and not a stain. At midday a bell did ring. Not the keep's. It was the small one over the door of the fishmonger's at the edge of the square, a little tin voice with a bright heart. It announced that a cart had arrived full of river fish silvery as knives, still flapping. The crowd of children who ran laughing were the best sound of the last 3 days. No one had ordered that bell to ring. It had done so because the world had a shape that included it and they had remembered to keep it. That was what mercy made memory of ordinary things. Toward evening, when the shadows stretched like cats and the heat turned from iron to wool, a figure dressed not in white and not in armor began again to come down the slope. The crowd saw him and murmured. His hair was as golden as the coins in the ledgers she had read, though dust had dimmed it. He walked as far as the last flag and stopped. He was not tall. He was broader than his clothes suggested. He carried in his hands a crown that had been dented years ago and never truly straightened. He set it down on the flagstones and stepped back and looked at her from across the distance of the slope. Jaime Lannister's brother had already yielded. Now the sister would not yet. But a man had brought a crown down the hill and left it with the dirt from his boots on its inner band. In another life, someone would have called that a ceremony. In this one, it was a fulcrum. She looked at it and saw not power but a piece of metal shaped to sit on a skull that had not yet been buried. She did not step forward. She let it lie there, visible to any who wished to look. "Tomorrow?" she said again quietly. And this time Tyrion did smile, because he knew the language of siege and of patience and of men who think they can outweight hunger and humility. He also knew that sometimes the weight that breaks a wall is not a battering ram but a loaf of bread on a table at the right hour. That night, she dreamed again without fire. She dreamed of a city where bells rang for births and for boats back from sea and for weddings and not for fear. She dreamed, which is a dangerous thing to do in a place built on stone and desire. But waking, for the first time in many days, did not feel like falling. On the fourth morning, the bells rang one clear note, then another, then stopped, as if a hand had lifted and reconsidered. The city lifted its head, dog-like, and waited. The note did not come, but the Red Keep's gate sent out a line of guards, no more than 20, walking with their hands open and their heads bare, and behind them came a palanquin with its curtains hooked back and a woman inside wearing a dress that was neither white nor red but a strange neutral green. Her hair was loose and unadorned, and her face looked as if it had learned to be careful on its own. Daenerys did not move. The palanquin reached the bottom of the slope. The woman stood. She stepped down. She did not carry a crown. She did not look at the dragon. Her eyes went to the rope around the axe first, and then to the 2 children guarding it, and then to the square which smelled of bread and sweat and a fish someone had allowed to go a day too far. Only then did she look at Daenerys. "Terms," Cersei said. Her voice had always had wine in it. Today it had bile as well. It did not tremble. Daenerys listened as the bells rested in their towers, as the city leaned slightly toward the square, as the dragon rested his chin on the edge of the roof and watched the women who had come so far to be this moment. The air tasted of salt and metal and the butter that someone had used to fry onions. She spoke the words she had already shaped 2 days ago and that had not changed their shape since. They were not generous words and not cruel. They were safe. Cersei laughed once. A single bark that acknowledged how ridiculous this was and how ordinary. She looked at the crown where it lay on the stones where Tyrion had set it down, and something moved in her face that was not anger and not grief but some cousin of both that had come late to a funeral. She listened again. She did not nod. She did not shake her head. She stood like a stone that had decided it would be a woman for a day and then return to being stone. "I will come at dusk," she said finally. "If I come at all." She turned and went back up the hill, the palanquin left empty behind her like a shell on a beach. "You offered her a future," Jon said when they stood in the slack after the palanquin disappeared. "She will choose whether to stand in it." "She will," Daenerys said. She looked at the square and at the rope around the axe and at the dragon's eye and at the faces that had grown familiar in 3 days without her knowing their names. "So will we." Evening came on like a hand over a candle, lowering not patch by patch but altogether, and the city made that softer sound that comes when men have eaten and are inventing reasons to be grateful in the face of fatigue. The children fell asleep on their chairs and were carried home, and the axe lay under its rope with no one to watch it because even symbols get a night off. Cersei did not come. The white flags on the slope waited for no one but the wind. Navies do not appear on a day like that, and armies do not march. What happens is more human and therefore harder. A woman chooses a story she will allow to be told about her, and another woman chooses the story she will make possible for others to tell. The city slept under that difficulty, and the dragon watched it sleep, and the queen did not. She walked once more the perimeter in the quiet hour before first light and stood looking over the river where a frog croaked like a bad hinge and felt in herself the steadiness that might yet convince a stone. In the gray just before dawn, a small bell rang. A tinkle from high up, as if someone with a gentle hand had tried it to see if it still worked. The sound trembled down and across tiles and into open windows. A second answered it from a different tower. The city stirred, not sure whether to be afraid. The Red Keep's gate opened once more. Cersei walked out, alone. She wore no crown and no color that meant anything. She did not carry anything in her hands because they had already carried too much. Her face was as it had been years since anyone had seen it. Undecorated and unarmed, with the strength plain in the lines and the vanity and old spice that clung to the air. She walked to the place where Daenerys had stood and stopped. She looked not at the dragon and not at Daenerys but at the people. There was a long silence in which the city, despite itself, could not help but like her for that. She opened her mouth. Her voice was smaller than anyone had ever heard it because for once she did not try to pour wine through it. "I am Cersei of House Lannister," she said. "I once wore a crown. I did this city harm in the belief that I preserved it. I was wrong." She swallowed. It was not as dramatic as anyone would have liked. It was just a woman trying to get past a word. "I will stand trial as the queen demands." She lifted a hand and touched her belly without meaning to, a reflex hard as stone. "It is possible there is a child," she said, and for a breath something like humanity crossed her face. A recognition that her body was an argument no one could win in public. "If there is, I ask that your mercy keep it from my sins." The crowd's sound did not swell. It concentrated, as if the people had become a lens. Daenerys did not move. The dragon breathed once, long as a deep sea. Grey Worm's eyes did not change. Jon looked at Daenerys, always at her, waiting to see how she would place this stone. "Then come," Daenerys said into the morning. "Come down and stand where we all have been standing for 3 days, and we will put you in a room with bread and water and a window, and we will choose 12 persons of this city to listen to the accounts of what you have done and what you have not done, and we will accept the verdict. And until that time, there will be no more bells rung for fear." Cersei looked at her for a long moment without hatred. It was a face she had not known how to make until now. She nodded once, and in that nod was something of a queen, and then she came down the last steps because sometimes a woman must at last stop being a stone. The city let out the breath it had been holding for 4 days, and the air smelled immediately of green things, as if relief had an odor that could call leaves back to life. It would not be simple. It would not be clean. It would not be the last dangerous morning they would see. There would be men who had watched this and hated it and would angle to undo it with whispers and books and prices and old habits. But that day, the axe lay under its rope, and the drag unslept, and the queen walked through the square like a woman among other women, and no fire ate the sky. Each hour broke over the city like the sea and left it whole. And when the bells sound in years to come, someone will say to a child in a kitchen where water sits in a clay jar and bread thumps the board, "Do you know why they ring so softly?" And the child will listen and say, "Because we decided they should." And if that is not true in every way, it will be true enough to keep a city standing.